Welcome to Health Professional Radio. So glad that you could join us today. I'm your host, Neal Howard, and it's a pleasure to welcome into studio Mr. Greg O'Brien. Greg's got more than 35 years of experience as a writer, editor, investigative reporter, and publisher, with work having appeared in the Boston Herald, Boston Magazine, Arizona Republic, the Associated Press, Denver Post, Huffington Post, and many, many others. In addition, he's the editor or author of several books, including his latest work on Pluto, Inside the Mind of Alzheimer's. Greg is in studio with us today to discuss Alzheimer's disease from the perspective of the patient, being an Alzheimer's patient himself. How are you doing this afternoon, Greg?
I'm doing okay. Thanks, It's an honor to be on your show.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I rarely get to interview someone who is living with Alzheimer's, and it's extremely important that we hear from you today. Let's talk about Alzheimer's in general for just a moment. What exactly, from your perspective, is Alzheimer's disease?
Well, when I speak, I use this analogy, and I ask people, how many people ever lived in a home with a basement? Most people will raise their hand. And how many people have ever lived in a home in a basement and done your laundry down there? They raise their hand. How many people have ever lived in a home with a basement, done your laundry downstairs, someone up in the kitchen didn't realize you were down there and turned the light off? What do? You scream. You probably drop an F-bomb because you want them to turn the light back on. And that's what the early stage of Alzheimer's is. The light goes on, the light goes off. The light goes on, the light goes off. You never know when it's going to happen. But you do know that someday there's going to be no one up in the kitchen to turn the light back on, and it goes off forever. And that's really, in layman's terms, what Alzheimer's is about. It's about a synapse, the current going from one neuron to the next, missing its mark. And in time, the brain cells die, and you go deeper into the progression. But there's a stereotype of Alzheimer's, which is not true. And all the experts will tell you this, that you're 85 years old and you're going to die. And everyone says, well, that's too bad. But, as a great Bugs Bunny said, don't take life too seriously because nobody gets out alive. But Alzheimer's is a disease that can take 20, 25 years to run its course. It's like having a sliver of your brain shaved every day. And there are millions of us out there who are living with Alzheimer's in the early stage, not the end stage. And it's often very difficult because we have to work, we have to raise families, we have to deal with the taboo. And I lost my mother. I know it's a long answer, but it's good background. I lost my maternal grandfather, my mother to Alzheimer's, my paternal uncle, and before my father died, he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And after I had the clinical tests and the brain scans, SPECT scans, which confirmed the diagnosis, which the doctors said were exacerbated by 2 serious head injuries, and that's another subject we could talk about. And I also carry the Alzheimer's marker gene APOE4.
So there is that genetic aspect.
Well, there is, but Alzheimer's can strike anyone, any age, any gender, any color, anything. It doesn't. It's not. Most cases of Alzheimer's are not through the genes, and it's a progressive disease, but until we realize that it's functioning it is devastating millions of people who are dealing with this disease and have to live on a day-to-day basis. We're not going to take it seriously enough to cure it.
When you say taking it seriously enough, there are enough of us who are dealing with this disease in one way or another. And if not, at least we are aware of its existence. You've written this book. Many of us only hear about it from the perspective of a caregiver. How do you trust what someone is saying when they're talking about their feelings? How do those around you trust you when you talk about your feelings or some of your symptoms on a day-to-day basis?
Well, a lot of times people can see the symptoms. I used to tell people that I thought of my brain years ago as a big garbage pail, and I'd throw all sorts of crap in it. Good stuff, bad stuff, trivia, stuff that no one needs to know about. And in Alzheimer's, your ability to process shrinks, diminishes. And so I think of my brain today as a flower pot. And I believe, I cut up a frog in high school, so that's about as much as I know about medicine, but I believe that, and other doctors have said this, you can pick and choose what you put in that flower pot to protect. And people could look at this. It's like finding new pathways in the brain. Mm-hmm. And the essence, as a person anyway, not my soul, but as a person, I'm a writer communicator, and that's the last thing that I'm going to let go. But right now, 60% of my short-term memory is gone in 30 seconds. I don't recognize people in familiar places, including my wife on 2 occasions. I don't recognize familiar places. I go into incredible rage. My judgment is shot. My filter is shot. I have balance problems. I see things that aren't there. And it's there are times I'll pick up a phone, and in the moment, not all the time, I can't remember how to dial. And I get so angry I throw the phone across the room, or I pick up my lawn sprinkler. Everyone's thinking of their lawns this time of year, and I don't know, and I'm a lawn guy, and I don't know, I love my lawn, and I don't know what the sprinkler does, and I crash it against an oak tree because I'm pissed. Or in the wintertime, when I open the door to our wood stove and my brain tells me it's okay to push that smoking hot piece of glass back until my hand burns in a 2nd-degree burn. That's stuff that a lot of people don't want to talk about. Mm-hmm. I'm only talking about it because I've seen my family members go through it, and shame on me as a journalist for not talking about it. So on Pluto, Inside the Mind of Alzheimer's is the first book written by an investigative reporter embedded inside the mind of Alzheimer's, chronicling the progression of his own disease.
Talk about the title, On Pluto. Why specifically Pluto as the planet to be on as an Alzheimer's patient?
Well, it's a place of dense isolation, but more to the point, when I was a young man, I was at the Arizona Republic, a reporter there. I was covering organized crime and the mafia and all that, and I went off record with a lot of sources. And for some reason, because I was fascinated then, I'm 66, and so I'm in my early 20s when I'm there, and I was fascinated with the planet Pluto and would tell people record where no one can hear what is said, and I'm going to take you out to the planet Pluto. And over time, my buddies would pick up, and then when we go out to the places where, a lot of times you have an intimate discussion with someone, and someone says, "Are you taking us out?" My buddies would say, "Are you taking us out to Pluto?" And I would say, "Yeah," and where no one can hear what is said. And the urge to drift out in Alzheimer's is great, because it's a 24/7 fight, and sometimes you just want to let go. And so I had to invent a place that I was comfortable with. And so I called it Pluto. And my mom and dad and uncle and grandfather have been there, and I know there's a day when I won't be back, and when that happens, I want people to know where I am. So I called it Pluto. If people look up Pluto itself, if anyone's interested, Google it. There are a lot of similarities between Alzheimer's and the planet Pluto, a place of dense isolation, darkness.
Absolutely. You've authored several, or been on the editing staff of several books. Is your writing, as far as books are concerned, something that you started after your diagnosis, and before that, were you strictly into news, investigative reporting? How did that come about, and what types of struggles being an Alzheimer's, someone living with Alzheimer's and an author?
Well, probably 40, 45 years in the newspaper business, which you explained before. The first book I did was a book with a subsidiary of Viking Penguin. Were 2 books, A Guide to Nature on Cape Cod and the Islands, and O'Brien's original Guide to Cape Cod and the Islands, and or an Insider's Guide to Cape Cod and the Islands. And that was, probably 25, 30 years ago. So writing is my muscle memory, but maybe more to the point, when, first of all, I was my mother's caregiver. We live on Cape Cod, and I was one of 10 kids, but the only family member here. And when I started the symptoms, I was in denial, which is a normal thing for that situation, but for people in general. There's a chapter in my book, it's a quote from Mark Twain, "Denial ain't just a river in Egypt."
Yeah.
And we all live in denial. And but when I got to the point after my serious head injuries, after the experiencing the symptoms, and after my diagnosis, I had the pity party.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a strong faith, but I had the WTF talk with God, and you can figure out what that means.
Absolutely.
And then I decided to go to my muscle memory, and I wrote down 2,000 pages of notes of everything I was afraid I would forget. And I was chronicling my mother's progression as well as my own. And from that, working with 3 New York Times best-selling writers, friends of mine, Bill Martin, Anne LeClaire, and also, most notably, Lisa Genova, who wrote the book Still Alice and is a very close friend. I just had dinner with her last night. I produced on Pluto, and Lisa wrote the foreword. Lisa Genova wrote the foreword on Pluto, and that's how the book was produced.
Great. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. I'd like to invite you back for some more segments and talk much more about living with Alzheimer's, your book, and more about your life in general.
Oh, anytime.
All right.
It's passing information on, which is good.
Thank you so much. You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neal Howard, and we've been in studio with Mr. Greg O'Brien, diagnosed with younger onset Alzheimer's disease back in 2009 at the age of 59. He's spoken across the country about his experience living with Alzheimer's disease and at events including the Alzheimer's Association Massachusetts, New Hampshire chapter, which is there in his community. And he's also been featured in the documentary film Living with Alzheimer's, A Place Called Pluto. And he's been here with us today discussing his new book on Pluto, Inside the Mind of Alzheimer's, and also some of his day-to-day struggles and some of his observations as someone living with Alzheimer's. Transcripts and audio of this program are available at healthprofessionalradio.com.au and also at hpr.fm, and you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes.